Welcome in, everybody. The tides have turned just a little bit. If you've been watching our series, you know that Laurie Grenya has been interviewing all of our consulting staff. But now the tides have turned, and now it's my turn to interview Miss Laurie Grenya. If you don't know, my name is Deborah Jeffries, and I work here at HR Answers, and we're going to grill Laurie on her favorite HR topic, which if you know Laurie, you already know the answer to this question, don't we? But before we get to the topic, why HR? How did you land in HR, and what keeps you here?
So I also landed in HR. It was, I guess, I can't 100% say landed. I was working in state service, and had thought for a really long time about the fact that I wanted to know more about business management. And in the state, that meant working for Department of Administrative Services. And I had this idea that it would be really interesting to go from all the different divisions that had to do with the business management operations, so procurement and budget and some of those types of things, and start that way. But thought, well, that would be interesting, and HR was on that list because, of course, that's a division. With absolutely no purpose in mind, I had been doing job rotations, which was a way to develop your skills in other areas. Had gone on one job rotation, really was not my cup of tea. Wanted to stop that immediately. And the HR manager called me and said, Laurie, what do you know about databases? I'm thinking this is going someplace IT-ish. No, he says, we need some database help in the classification and compensation unit down in HR. They're working on this study. There's a lot of data to manage. What do you think? So I explained to him my data skills. He said, that sounds good. He goes, what do you know about class and comp? And I said, well, I know I'm an office research analyst at that point in time, and I get a paycheck every month.
That's good. That's a nice start.
He's like, well, we're going to go with the database stuff. So we'd like you to start in a couple weeks. I never left. And that's been over 20 years ago.
Okie dokie.
So, yeah.
So, but some good training ground, being able to do the kind of job share and the job rotation activities.
Yeah, my very first state job, I was hired actually as a receptionist in a governor's policy office. And it just happened to be the year after the Oregon Health Plan was implemented. And it was the office administering that policy set for the governor.
Wow.
So all the health committees and councils were in that office. I wasn't necessarily responsible for that, but putting together all their materials, listening to a lot of legislation, figuring out how a bill really does become a law, and it's kind of like the song, but not really. And just kind of learning the political environment, which had never been anything that I'd done before that.
Sure.
So started there, then went to the state budget office, which was a huge eye-opener to, oh my gosh, now the legislature said you can do these things, but you have to fund them, and different funding types, and how to manage that, payroll and accounting involvement in all of those types of things. And then over to the procurement office, which was the thing I ran away from really quickly, and then HR.
Okay. So that gave you some good foundations into HR, right? You got to see a lot.
Well, yeah, 85% of the state's budgets at that point in time, years ago, were spent on the people doing the work. So very few program dollars, lots of human dollars.
Okay. So there must have been some organizations prior to the state that you worked for that may have also helped you see HR maybe. What were those like, or
Probably
give us a feel for those?
A little bit. Retirement investments.
Okay.
Worked for a firm actually in the Portland area, small family-owned firm, doing essentially the tax filings for people's retirement investments, and they were an investment firm. So it was manually doing all of those forms. It was the big, huge eye-opener too. Yes, please plan for your retirement, because there's no magic wand later. So, and that's still true today. And prior to that I worked in a medical office doing a lot of records management, those types of things. And before that was babysitting, Subway. Oh, UPS. Worked for UPS for a while. Hazardous materials, interestingly enough, which is actually what I went to school for.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And do I also recall there might be something that you, as our current owner and our previous owner, also have in common? Was there a call center or
Oh, an answering
service, right?
Yeah, I worked at an answering service for a good period of time down in the Willamette Valley.
Yeah.
Lots of clients, lots of customers, lots of data.
Well, you kind of like data.
I do.
Just,
It's a whole thing.
sometimes I think that we don't know it at the time, but little things happen along the way that then it's like, well, you were just supposed to be here, right? It kind of led you there. So, and I think sometimes it's interesting how many of us have different paths, but we had some similarities that is kind of intriguing to me. So now you've asked each of us what organizations we now work with. So it would not be fair if we didn't ask you the same question.
And one of the reasons, and I remember when Judy interviewed me when I applied for the consulting role here at HR Answers of why am I leaving state service? Why do I want to come to consulting? And my answer was, I want to broaden the experience, because I knew quite a bit about government compensation at that point in time and felt really comfortable in that space. Granted, I always think things are changing and there's stuff to learn, but excuse me, as far as the fundamentals of government compensation, I'd been doing it for a number of years. It was time to expand. So whether that meant other government entities or learning more about private industry compensation, that's what I was looking for at the time.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, and I have to say, we are the beneficial entity. We are the benefactor of your background, because there's no doubt that we were doing a tremendous amount of public sector work before you got here. But since you've gotten here, that, especially with the compensation background, really has been exponential. And our clients have been very, very lucky to have you. And quite frankly, Judy has always been kind of known as a compensation guru. And I think that the torch has been officially passed, at least from my perspective. So I'm just saying that. Just saying.
I have to say, though, that I think our legislature had a little bit to do with the success. There was some perfect timing in that transition and that new pay equity law hitting at the same point in time.
This is true.
And I do think, though, that the experience in state government, having seen that struggle in the legislature and prior committees who were studying the gender pay gap, excuse me, were definitely components of what led to some pretty good success for us.
Absolutely, there's no doubt. But if we didn't have somebody on staff who understood that, and people might not be aware because of your knowledge and because of your connections and your understanding of that, you had the opportunity to be part of conversations before pay equity was publicly rolled out to all employers. And so we had a sense of some of what was coming down the pike and some of the pitfalls or some of the questions that really needed to be asked and understood beforehand. And we had somebody who knew how to ask the right questions.
Well, and we're still struggling with some of that too.
Aren't we all?
That's then, just a little pandemic on the heels.
Just a little something.
Yeah, nothing big.
Hey, something that we all got to experience.
That's right. And we continue to experience. It's not done yet.
No, lady. No, it isn't, is it?
No.
So, kind of already probably have given the answer to this question in terms of the passion, but what is it about compensation because obviously our viewers have been watching the fact that there are a variety of things in HR, and some organizations are so large that they can kind of silo some of that. Absolutely. In the Northwest as a whole, we're smaller entities, and there isn't a lot of I've only ever done this, or I've only done two things. We have a lot of generalists or HR business partners who are quite versed in and doing a lot of things. Why compensation? What is it about that is so intriguing and exhilarating to someone like you, and to someone like me? I just kind of run the other way.
It has to be the puzzle of putting all the pieces together. And the puzzle's more complex with pay equity in our state, and granted in other states too. But we still have one of the most aggressive pay equity laws as far as what an employer has to do. Mm-hmm. But it is the area of compensation has any number of laws, compliance that you must adhere to, as well as, and I use this phrase a lot, choose your own adventure. Because what you're really trying to figure out is how to incent people through money to do what you're asking them to do and or do more, and what's the right lever within everything in the compensation arena. And I mean total compensation, whether that's benefits or leave or pay or any of the other things that we can put in there. What's the right mix for each organization is unique. And so it is definitely a puzzle. The other side of it, and I think the thing that always made me really excited about it when I worked in state government, was that what I was working on touched 66,000 people's lives in a fundamental way that allowed them to live the way they wanted to live, to strive for something different for themselves, that I saw every month when the paycheck hit my bank account. And there was something for me that was really exciting about that, but also scary. Be scared of the choices you're making in compensation because of the impact. So healthy fear mixed with kind of exciting stuff when it has that kind of a footprint.
Wow. So in some respects, I'm also hearing each of those items are some things from an HR standpoint in terms of some considerations. Yep. And we've talked from a consulting standpoint, organizations thinking about what their philosophy is around compensation. What else might be considerations from an HR professional standpoint and comp? Is there other things that people should be looking at or thinking about?
Absolutely. I think there's probably three other things. So philosophy is, what does the organization want pay to do for it? That's the simple question behind that one. What's your market? Where are you getting and losing your people? Where you get them from, where you lose them to. And that is changing significantly right now with the onset of remote work. And there are other considerations associated with that. Adding to that is where do you want to be in the competition spectrum? Or do we want to lead? Do we want to meet? Do we want to lag? And not only what do we want, if you're a nonprofit or if you're a government entity, how are your constituents going to feel about that? Right. Especially if we're talking taxpayer dollars or donation money. Are you using it for the thing that we asked you to do as an organization? And for some reason, the public and some donors really struggle to see that paying employees is part of what you asked us to do.
Right.
Right. And how you shape that up for them. And then really the last part is all those other components of benefits. What's mandated, what are discretionary, how does that marry up into a total cash value for an individual as well as for the payout for the organization?
So I sort of know the answer to some of this. Again, I'm not the expert. Tools. I mean, I'm thinking about, let's go back to conversations that you and I have had, as well as we've had with our own clients. You've got people who are definitely in the know around compensation. And then you've got the novice who is perhaps trying to maintain a program, a system that maybe they understand, maybe they don't understand. What are the tools, if someone doesn't know, that they probably should be looking for inside their organization, or tools they should be asking others about to help them understand what they've got? Let's go into that toolbox.
Tools are slim in this particular area of HR. And I will also say, if your organization doesn't see comp as part of HR, there's nothing wrong with that. Many organizations actually see compensation as part of finance.
Gotcha.
And accounting. Unlike me, who was highly confused when asked the question, what do you know about class comp? And I said, I got a paycheck every month. That's not compensation. That's the outcome of compensation work. Payroll is not compensation. But frequently, that's the person we find in an organization responsible for it.
Right.
And that's okay. It's just two different things. One's strategic planning, one is outcome and delivery of the plan. Right. So ultimately, World at Work is probably one of the best resources that is out there. SHRM also has some newly developed resources associated with this. There are, World at Work has a number of chapters out there. Columbia Willamette Compensation Group is a great one, to get a network of people who are everywhere in the spectrum, from very experienced with this to novice and trying to figure it out. It is something that you find more on when you Google. But I will jump ahead to a tip and trick. If you're Googling something, make sure the date is no more than like 12 months old, right. Even on tactical information about how do I do this, because it's changing, and it's changing really rapidly. So you don't want to look at the white paper from 12 years ago. That's not going to do you well. But when you get right down to it, network of people and organizations that is their primary purpose, that's what they do, are going to be your best resources.
As a novice, okay, in the compensation, I'm also thinking that understanding the terminology would be huge. I mean, if I'm thinking about a tool like a glossary to understand, because sometimes going into a conversation around compensation and, okay, base pay. Okay, I got that one. But when we talk about some of how we pay or why we pay, I would think that, and to your point, some of the vocabulary has changed because organizations have morphed, or because the way we pay, how we pay, why we pay, for what we pay has changed, or some of the rules now around that have altered. Some things have become more sophisticated. So might there be something that might be a tip or a trick around the glossary or some of the acronyms even? Because I'm thinking part of something we do here is help educate people so that they do understand it. I've been privileged to attend and sit through some of your conversations with clients and or in a class. You do a nice job of explaining in a way that people can understand. So might you just comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, the glossary of terms is probably one of the harder things. If you are a trained compensation professional, those words have certain definitions. Most organizations don't have the luxury of a trained compensation professional working for them, at least not in Oregon, because again, most of our organizations are fairly small. They're lucky to have an HR generalist who knows something about compensation, which is excellent. Every organization creates their own nomenclature around this, unfortunately. So some of it is figuring out what is that. So be curious. When somebody says, I need the grade to be increased, what do you mean by that?
Right.
What are you actually trying to accomplish? Because I know what increasing a grade means. They might mean increasing a person in the grade, not the actual grade.
Gotcha.
So getting down to what do you want the outcome to be and work backwards for how do we do that is probably the best way to get there. What I know about compensation, especially now that I've been exposed to lots of different organizations' versions of it, is there are no two systems that are exactly alike.
Gotcha.
Period. There aren't. There will be variances and lots of them. They're nuanced, though. This one little thing that they do different makes a world of change in their system, in their structure, how their pay administration will work out. So learning whatever organization you're in and how they talk about it and what those definitions mean is develop your own dictionary for what that means in your organization. If you want to know what those words actually mean, you can Google them.
Okay.
It may have nothing to do with what you're talking about. I think the first time I ran across that was somebody said, we need to run a compa ratio because that's what we've always done.
Right.
So I ran a compa ratio, knowing what that is, knowing what the actual math is behind a compa ratio. That's not what they were doing, but that's what they were calling it.
Gotcha.
And it actually came out in a litigation that Judy was working on. She's like, Laurie, will you take a look at this? Because I don't think I'm seeing what's trying to be explained here. And neither of us were, because the terminology in our head was compa ratio meant something. That was not what it meant for that organization. Now, the weird part was they were trying to say that it did mean that.
Oh.
But what they were using in their mathematical calculation were not the things that you would use for that. So if you're going to do it, write out what it actually means.
Gotcha.
So,
because I'm thinking that in some respects that could be a bit of one of the missteps in this scenario, is that people are trying to talk the language, but they're using it incorrectly in some respects.
Yeah.
What might be some other, from your experience, with our clients, other projects, other activities, what have been some of the missteps around compensation as a whole? Maybe there's broad missteps and some specific ones?
So starting at the broad level.
Okay.
And the one I see most commonly is an organization thinking that doing compensation design work is one and done.
Okay.
And that comes along with not putting in place a maintenance plan. So we designed this really great thing to meet all these objectives that we had outlined pretty clearly, just like any other project, define the goals, put in place those solutions, but we never went back and tested and refined and tested and refined and tested and refined. And compensation is a living, breathing thing for an organization. And that's largely because the organization is a living, breathing thing. It's going to shift.
Sure.
So are the people working for the organization going to shift. And compensation is finding that tie, essentially, between what the organization needs and what the people need that are doing the work of the organization. If for whatever reason you've had a massive amount of retirements in your organization, you have a whole bunch of young people coming in, you're going to start hearing a whole lot of crying and whining about the fact that the organization is making contributions to retirement and paying for a Cadillac health plan that, quite honestly, they don't see the value of in retirement. And number two, they're healthy. They don't care about that. They'd rather see more base pay.
Right.
And so you have to be able to shift with those things in an organization. But if you're not watching that data about what's going on with the demographics of your employee and what they're interested in, and where the organization is trying to go or grow, you're never going to be able to keep that balance going on for the organization. So maintenance, maintenance, maintenance. And we used to say in comp, every 5 years you needed to check in on your market. Now it's more like every 18 months.
18 months, from 5 years to 18 months.
Yeah, and we dropped down to about 3 years, probably 7 years ago is where we started advising that. It's really every 3 years. The market's just changing too rapidly, and that's because businesses are changing so rapidly. And quite honestly, the employee base is changing rapidly. Right. And so all of that means we got to pick up the pace on comp. And it's not necessarily an inexpensive endeavor to deal with market and to get good market data for your organization, but you need to stay on top of that. So that's probably the biggest one, is that it's not one and done. It's got to have a maintenance plan. You have to keep working at it. Okay. And there's a lot that goes there. The simplest things are not practicing your policy and procedure. So when you do define that we're a seniority-based system, you're here another year, you're going to get more compensation, right, that actually happens. Or you say you're a performance-based system. So in other words, people have to hit certain benchmarks to get increases, but you never do performance evaluations. And you're still giving people increases.
Right.
Those things don't line up.
Right.
Employees should be able to have a clear line of sight for how they can affect their own compensation and how that changes over time for them. The way they would typically do that is through some training and education from the organization and being able to read those policies. But if we're not following them, they're left wondering, well, then how do I do anything? Right. So we frequently talk about it as compensation shouldn't be a black box. It should be very simple, basic math that you can explain to anyone in your organization. And not because they aren't smart, but because it needs to be simple. Right. They need to be able to rely on it.
Well, and quite frankly, from an employee perspective, if this is out there and it's out on the table, then it isn't a guessing game. And when we talk about from a retention standpoint, I know what is out there. I know what to expect. I know what's been put in writing. I know what's, quote, promised. I know what I'm working with. And if it isn't, then I'm hoping, she said, that I can have a conversation about that, or I can ask some questions about that. So, okay.
We do find a lot of organizations in that situation where they say, I don't know why. We actually just finished working with a client who has in their, I'll call it myth of the organization, the fact that they matched to the 75th percentile. Well, the new HR manager and now general manager in the organization first and foremost said, what is the 75th percentile? What does that mean?
What does that really mean?
So we unpacked that, and I said, well, from a very technical standpoint, this is what it means. This is what we would be looking at if we were comparing to the 75th percentile. There's also a part of that equation that was missing. What in your grade are you comparing to the 25th percentile to say you're competitive? Is it your first step? They happen to be a step and grade system. So I've got numbered grades with multiple steps on each grade. Is it your first step that you're comparing to the 75th percentile, meaning you're hiring people just north of the market? Or is it the middle? Or is it the maximum? And they had no idea what any of that was. So they continued to come back and say, well, we've got this myth. How do we address this? You address it as we don't know and there's no documentation. So what we are going to do going forward is, and then we filled the blank with what that strategy is going to look like going forward. But here's a group saying, well, we need to be able to hit the 75th percentile. Well, we don't know what that means. And we don't know where we're comparing it. And who in the organization was continuing the myth? The people who are about to retire. Because they've been there the longest.
Sure.
And they went to them. I said, you could ask them. Were you here when presentations were made about why we were doing it this way? Do you recall what that was? Maybe we could recreate it and see how we're doing. No, I don't really actually know what that means. Oh, okay, good. Talk to people. That's okay too. But write down those methodologies.
I was going to say,
so that you can replicate them later.
And I know it's just kind of maybe an educated guess, but based on that experience alone, what percentage of organizations actually do a good job of documenting, writing down why their decisions were their decisions, or how they define, or when that happened? I mean, do you have any observations about that?
I think the hardest part is because many organizations that we work with come to us because they don't have that expertise, we probably have a lopsided view of that. So a good deal of those that we work with have an idea in their head of what they're trying to do. I love it when the answer is we want to recruit and retain qualified people. Yes, so does the rest of the world. What else do you want to do? Just to, it's like, I already got that one covered. That we're going to work on. But, the idea is we want to drive people away. Nobody says that.
Right.
So, I think we probably see a better than fair share of people who are already struggling in this area, so we don't see a lot of documentation. I will tell you, pay equity, that law, because it's all about form, structure, process, procedure, administration, has allowed probably a broader view of different organizations' compensation. And I will say that when people do have it written down, they are much more successful in consistency in their pay administration, which means much less opportunity to potentially say it was a discriminatory practice. So we've got proof that says you write it down and you follow it, you are way better off from a mitigating risk and liability for lawsuits potential than you are without it. And it doesn't have to be complex. I think that's the other thing that I like organizations to understand. We can start small. Build something that will make sense and is easy to administer, and then grow from there. You don't have to start with all the bells and whistles. There are very complicated compensation systems out there with pay differentials and incentives for this and incentives for that and variance for performance and market competitive. There's so many different ways of approaching it. When it gets right down to it, it doesn't have to be complex. It just has to make sense.
Makes sense for the organization and what the organization is doing.
Yeah, but you should be able to explain that to people when you're hiring them. Right. Supervisors should be able to answer questions about, hey, how does my pay move? Does my pay move?
Right.
What do I have to do to impact that? And if the answer is there isn't anything you can do to impact that because we're a single rate of pay employer, I think people should know that from day one. Do I want to sign up for this employer knowing that I may have no future pay potential? And in some jobs, that's what's expected and it's okay.
Right.
In other jobs, it's not what's expected, and you should think twice about that choice.
Right. Absolutely. So, about that kind of thinking twice element, what skills then from an HR professional standpoint to be successful in the comp area? Let's say I'm intentionally going to school. I want to study HR. Compensation seems to be a thing of interest. What if I was coming to you and saying informational interview? What kinds of things would you tell me I need to be focused on or interested in or willing to put in the time and energy around or put up with?
Yeah. I think, this is true in other HR arenas too, but the business acumen piece of this, being able to see what's coming, so that environmental scanning, and not just in what's happening in HR, but what's happening in the business that we're in. Things like being able to forecast, it looks like there's going to be a big gap in our ability to get engineers, or right now, healthcare professionals of any sort. Right. Those types of forecasts are fundamental for compensation professionals to get in front of, because that's when you start thinking about, do we incent these particular areas to get people in? And contrary to popular belief right at the moment, there are ways to write those incentives under Oregon's pay equity law that are completely legal. So we actually don't need the exception that's out there for recruitment and retention bonuses. We can get there without them. But you do have to have a policy and you have to follow it.
Okay.
So the getting in front of that, so business acumen is a big one. You've got to have a firm understanding of the financials of your organization as well. What is feeding employee pay? What money is covering those things? And if we're seeing money go down in particular areas, are we moving towards layoffs associated with that? Are we shifting those funds into something else? So being able to forecast the employee impacts from what's going on in the business gets down in the weeds of compensation. Can we save something through a compensation mechanism? There isn't always a comp answer associated with those things, but many times there are. How do we keep the few people that we have? Might we need to start putting in place some moving allowances for it? Well, I would say reimbursements at this point in time in Oregon, but moving reimbursements to get more people in the door, because we got to get them from out of state. We've tapped out the state. Right. Pay attention to what's going on with employment department statistics around the various areas of work and our ability to get employees from those. Employee turnover in the organization. Being aware of those things can get you in front of the manager knocking on your door with their hair on fire because they don't have anybody to get X done. Well, if you've had the data sitting in the HRIS database or in all the resignation letters with the person next door, we aren't paying attention to the data that's signaling, hey, there might be something going on here. How do we help? What do we do with this? So watching the data, which for me is, you either got to be super strong on that HR database that you have, or you got some really mad Excel skills, because you need that stuff to just turn out for you on a regular basis. Hunting it down every single time you think you need it,
Not your best choice. It'll take too long. Yeah. Well, and again, back to reactionary to situations instead of being proactive and being able to put things in place to get that data and verify your data. And would it be safe to also complement your data with kind of your pulse surveys in, are people staying? Do they want to stay? Do they want to be here? Because the culture of the organization, money is nice. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt that it's usually in the top 5 of things, the reason people stay. There are other factors that hit above it that if we aren't focusing on those too, so that there's a nice complement between all of those.
There's actually a psychology behind pay. If anybody wants the cartoon, I can send it to them. Just email us. But this has been studied over and over and over again. And let me start by saying it does not matter what minimum wage is. Minimum wage could be $40 an hour, and this would still be true. For any worker that is making within $3 an hour, of minimum wage. They are motivated by money, but only as long as it takes for them to spend it. And the average paycheck is gone in 2 weeks. So if there isn't something else keeping them engaged in your organization between paychecks, they will look elsewhere for a better paycheck. And that is the reason they will leave. They will say it's for money because they don't realize that they're not being stimulated otherwise. You have to keep them stimulated. Once you get past that $3 relationship, it is about the ability to contribute to the organization. It is not about the paycheck. So you could pay your best contributor, or let me say this differently, you could pay one of your highest level professionals 5 times what the market says. And if they don't feel like they're allowed to make a contribution to the organization, they will leave for the ability to get that and less money, because the money doesn't matter to them. That's not what's about. They're making enough money ultimately that probably they're not paycheck to paycheck. Now every family situation is different, but that psychology hasn't changed in almost 30 years. It continues to prove true. And I think right now we see a lot of that. And when you hear HR professionals and any number of motivational speakers out there who are talking about employment, saying your culture matters, how people feel their alignment with the organization matters, the fact that they're safe there, that they know they're of value there, those types of things. It's not about so that they'll keep working and churning away. It's about the self-value proposition that each person feels. You have to have that. And it doesn't matter if you're a low-income worker or a high-income worker. The risk reward is just different in making the change. That's it. Contribution's it.
It is. And that is something that we can give to people.
Yep.
And recognizing work, the contributions, the achievements, the sense of belonging and connection, that doesn't have to cost you money. And that's the thing that I don't always think people understand is it costs you a little bit of time and energy to be able to do that and do it well. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not them. I mean, and me, who was, in my initial statement said, oh my gosh, I affect pay for 66,000 people. How cool is that? Nothing cooler than being a really great manager and a really great leader in an organization to show people how they're valued. And oh, by the way, you get a paycheck too. I say fun and a paycheck too, and I believe that because for me, it was important to find the fun.
Yeah.
It was important to find the fun, and I was picky about the organizations I applied with when I was ready to leave state service. Really picky. I only applied to 2 places.
Good for us.
But when it got right down to it, it was fun. I could see having fun at HR Answers. I needed that.
I think we all do. If
I
you're going to
do.
spend that kind of time at work, don't you want to
Yeah.
enjoy what you're doing? Have fun? I mean, what's some phrase of we spend more time at work? And maybe that's the wrong phrasing, at work. More time working
Yeah.
than quote home. And the answer is then you better like it. You better love it. And there were countless stories still continuing to play out in terms of the pandemic. People rethinking what they're doing.
Absolutely.
Am I in a place where I'm enjoying what I'm doing, that I find some level of fulfillment? And so if money is off the table and all other things are equal, I want to be enjoying what I'm doing and spending my time doing it.
Yep.
So, okay, so we've got skill sets.
Yep.
You're the master at tips and tricks here. What kinds of things that might be helpful regarding compensation, the broad topic of compensation?
And I'm going to come back to something that I think a lot of the consultants have said, which is use your network. And please don't just copy somebody else's compensation philosophy and policies.
Please.
And please also don't even just copy their spreadsheets. And yes, I've seen people do this. But don't. Start with, great, it's not a blank page. Does that work for us? Really peel apart each piece of that and then build structures that work with it. Borrow is fine. Borrow without refinement is not fine. And I've seen it time and time again. We want to look just like X. Well, they're trying to do something different than you are. Are you sure? I actually had somebody ask me a few weeks ago, and I think this is a question that's coming up a lot right now. How much of a differential should I pay to incent people to stay home?
Oh,
to keep working from
yes.
home, because we as an organization want to lessen our footprint.
Right.
And the more people that we can get to agree to work from home with all of the things they were going to do, we want to incent that for a while. Appropriate incentive? Yes. What data do you have about that? Interesting that that's what you want to do, because the companies that we've worked with are actually trying to incent people to come back
Yes.
to the office.
Yes.
Just the opposite of what you're trying to do. So if you happen to have just copied their policies and put them in place, you would have been incenting the wrong thing. Now, I don't think you'd miss something like that in most cases. But I've also read handbooks where people have said, oh, I really liked what they said about customer service, and it goes into all this retail stuff, so on and so forth. And they do property management for a living.
Right.
So confused at times. It is design what works for you. So tips and tricks are, there is, and I hate to say this, but it was something that was really frustrating to me when I started in comp, because I don't mind asking questions, but there was a good portion of time of my career where asking questions meant failure, which was completely wrong. So I spent an ungodly amount of time researching information first to try and answer all the questions when really knowledgeable people were sitting right next to me, so I just needed to ask. It was a lot easier when I started asking, but what I did find is in the comp arena, there isn't actually a lot, there's no textbook necessarily for compensation. You can't get compensation 101. That doesn't exist out there. There are things that World at Work has put together. There are things that different associations have put together. There are great resources to work with. I believe the reason why there is no Comp 101 textbook is because no two people do it the same. Because you're all driving at different goals with compensation, which means different turns. But if there were a trick that I would tell people is, if you're making a change, test it out. Make it a short-term pilot, the opportunity, see how it worked, and then put it in place as a regular circumstance. If it worked, if it didn't, refine it and try something else. But always start temporary, move it to regular, and if needed, define the trigger for the sunset. When does this thing stop? Especially in the incentive arena, because the conditions for which you're incenting likely will dissipate. How do you get out of this thing? Especially if you've got union agreements. You got to make sure you get into those letters of agreement, those memos of understanding. What triggers the start? How long is this going to last, and how do we stop it? All three.
And on the tested or trying it out, would you be trying it out across the board, or would you do with a segment of the population or department, so you keep that minimal?
Depends on what it is. And you're going to have to run the pay equity side to see how expansive that needs to be. So those comparable characteristics that we're required to evaluate all of our jobs for, whatever you're doing is going to at least have to cover all the roles with the same comparable characteristics. Because you're going to end up in inequities under the law if you don't. At least for Oregon.
I just would be like, do a beta test, but however.
It used to be you could do things like that pretty easily. And I do believe most organizations still do find ease in that. You just got to cover that pay equity base first.
And so because you've talked a little bit about pay equity, I'm going to throw an additional question in here. Just because some of the people who might be watching today, maybe some of them haven't done pay equity yet, or maybe some of them have done it and they've approached the 3-year mark, which is time for auditing. Pay equity went into effect several years ago. And for those that don't know, might you give people just a teeny little bit on something they should be taking a look at, or just a little primer on the off chance that someone is like, okay, they've referenced that a couple of times, but I think maybe I missed something because I had my head down working on that other project.
COVID may have hit
any number of things, and so I just and I ask because we have clients that have kind of, they missed it, quite frankly. So let's take a moment.
It's been on that list and you just keep changing the year.
Right.
I mean, It happens.
Absolutely.
It absolutely happens. So yeah, primer on pay equity. So Oregon's law went into effect. The major part of the law went into effect January 1st of 2019. So we've had a few years on this at this point in time. It was one that was kind of easy to miss because the legislation actually passed 2 years before that, and the final rules weren't written until 2 months before its implementation. So it gave organizations a tiny, tiny runway to get to compliance on something that takes a lot of work to get to. So all of these things that we've been talking about as far as having policy in place, knowing how pay changes for individuals, talking to people about that, so on and so forth, is required by the law. The law was about making sure the form and structure of compensation was in place and administered equitably across the organization. Within the organization, though, really big key here. So we're not talking about market. This is not saying we have a receptionist, we've compared it to the receptionists in the market, and we're paying competitively. That is not pay equity. That's market analysis. Pay equity is we know how our receptionist compares to the characteristics, and there are 5 in the law, to the accounting clerk, to the maintenance administrative person, to every position in the organization. So the first part of the law is all jobs have to be analyzed against the 5 comparable characteristics. You build your measurement structure for that. You get it. You have autonomy to do that. You apply it to all jobs. Any jobs that have the same characteristics have to have the same total compensation. So lots of effort into how we're going to measure this, how we measure our jobs and their differences. Then we have to go through a process of saying for all of those jobs that do have comparable characteristics, so let's say you had 5 receptionists, you need to evaluate the total compensation for those to ensure you've been following your own policy and practice that are consistent with the law's allowance for differences. So the law didn't say, Deborah, you're a president, Laurie's a president, we both have to make $100K a year. It said, you're both presidents, you have to have the same total compensation, but there's 8 things that might make a difference. Seniority could be one of them, performance could be one of them, productivity, location of the job, frequent travel, education, and experience. Most organizations use seniority, education, and experience. Education and experience are used when we recruit people. You have more experience coming into the job than I had, so you're going to get paid more. And we need a matrix that actually walks that out for us. I maybe came from a different organization and were, or let's not say a different one, let's say that HR Answers is spread across the nation. I happened to come from a different HR Answers branch, had more seniority, so I got paid more money because of that seniority. All those things, though, education, training, experience, performance, all have to be related to the job. So gone are the days when we get to say an individual who has a bachelor's degree in anything gets them paid higher. We have to be able to show how that thing that they have the degree in is related to the job they're doing for us. So that's a pretty big change for some organizations. Now, there are certain types of jobs who have argued, and I think pretty successfully, although it hasn't gone through court, to say that because of what they do, that any type of education might be appropriate because of the interactions they have with the general population that's out there. No case law on this yet, so we're still, being a little risk averse in how we guide on this. But first, compare all the jobs. That usually means you got to update all your job descriptions because what you're comparing has to be consistently documented. Update job descriptions. Then can we justify off the 8 differences? Are we doing okay in the pay? If there's an inequity, essentially something we couldn't justify, we have to correct it. And correcting is bringing up everyone to the highest pay in the comparable group that can be justified, and we back pay the difference for up to 2 years if that difference has existed for that full duration. So, and then every 3 years you need to audit this, and that's a safe harbor provision, something that leads to safe harbor. So it's a lot of work. Most organizations, let's say you have 100 plus employees, you probably have 50, maybe 50 different job titles. It's going to take 4 to 6 months to accomplish all that work. And strictly because you are probably the only person doing HR. If there's
Right.
only 100 in
You
the
have other things.
organization, you got other stuff going on,
Yep.
all that other HR stuff, and pay equity is just a portion of it. But it can be a pretty risky proposition because a violation occurs every time you issue payroll, and there's an inequity that shows up in it. So,
And I'm not wrong in saying there have been some employers who have said, I just might think that I'm going to pass on this and roll the dice.
and it's the same risk proposition. It's in the same area. It's a discrimination case,
Right.
which means you also have retaliation components in there. And I think most HR professionals are pretty aware of the fact that those are very expensive cases to lose. So not being willing to put in 4 to 6 months for a smaller to lower size middle organization is nothing in comparison to what you'll pay out if you're found to be in violation.
Right. And do I also understand that we've had some employers who have felt that they have complied with pay equity, that they've done pay equity because they took a look at male versus females?
Yes.
And
in Oregon, this particular law affects all protected classes. It's not just a gender law. In Washington, it is gender specific. Very similar components to all those things that I talked about you'd have to do, but it's only differences between male and female that we have to look at. In Oregon, it's all protected classes. So the way we figure it is if you're human and you're doing the job, you're protected. So you're in. We don't even do a demographic evaluation for us. And quite honestly, I think it would just add to any liability that you would have if inequities were found, especially if you are going to have to make a bit of a risk throw of the dice for a while because maybe you can't afford all the corrections. You may not want the additive information of defined that we knew that we had this discriminatory basis playing here and this is what was going on. So
right.
I don't want people to game the system by any stretch of the imagination, but I also understand an organization is probably not going to bankrupt themselves to make some of these corrections. And if you're an organization that has no policies around compensation, it's kind of a decision by decision basis for new hires, especially if you have multiple people doing the same kind of work, you are taking a much greater risk than an organization that has at least something in place and is trying to follow that.
Got it. Thank you for taking the extra time to go through that, because even if the viewers and the people who are part of the conference are watching this and they've got it, perhaps they know somebody who hasn't done this yet, and they might be able to provide a little context or perhaps share a brief portion of the interview. Okay, so thank you again for going there.
Yeah.
So wrapping our time up, common question that we've been using with all of the interviews is piece of advice, something from HR, all the things, that you've done over we're about 18 years in HR now, right? For you? Oh, 22. My apologies. We got to give credit where credit is due. So.
Well, scary. That's where all the gray hair's coming from.
Oh, well.
It's no longer my children.
I am not commenting on that. That is not my area to focus on. So, one thing in HR that you've learned above all else, piece of advice that you would share with someone else might be what?
It's 2 words.
Oh,
it's really, really simple.
Wow. Good for you. And
be curious.
Oh, okay.
Be curious. Find out why. Those are the things. Having been an HR director in-house, having done the specialty of compensation for years, getting to work in all areas of HR in consulting, curiosity wins the day almost every single time because it is more likely to get you to the truth of what's going on. All too often, things are taken on face value, not understanding the full story of what's going on. I remember being in-house as an HR director, about 850 employee organization, had a good, strong HR team, and I had to pick up some investigation workload pretty regularly just because we had a lot going on in the organization. And I remembered thinking, after 5 or 6 of them, every time we get to the end of one of these, it never seems to be the thing that was first brought to us as the concern.
Oh.
So me and my data had to start a spreadsheet to find out, what's going on and what is it? Is there something that's breaking down between what we think we're telling people we need and what's actually happening or how it's being viewed? Where's the piece? What I learned was there's lots of pieces. There wasn't any consistency to it. A lot of it was management training, though. So that speaks to me when you were mentioning that in your interview. But this idea of the way one person perceives it is not likely the full truth. So being curious, asking the questions, finding out the why 75th percentile. Why do you want to hang your hat on that? What does that mean to you right now managing this organization versus what it used to be and what people have carried along as their baggage? Be curious. Ask the questions. Get down to why. And when there's no more why to ask, you've probably got enough data.
Wow.
Then make decisions. Be curious.
Well, I'm guessing that those 2 words has helped you be successful in the work that you've done.
Yeah. I was not planning on being a business owner when I first came to HR Answers. Happy that I am. But being curious is finding out, what now in my world is, what does it mean to do marketing well? What does it mean to have a budget, and how close to it do we need to be, or how much flexibility can we have? What kind of financial planning do I need to think about now that I'm an owner and there are just different compensation things and tax things to deal with? So it's a different kind of adventure, but be curious. Carry you a long way.
It absolutely will. Wow. I like it. I like it. Well, I often share with people, ask and listen as some superpowers. And so I think that would go hand in hand with that, because it gets in the curious side in terms of asking, but also that listening piece hopefully would indicate to the other person that they matter, that they're valued in terms of input, which gets to your earlier comments, and that if we can keep our mouth closed, we'll learn from others and see that there's so many other perspectives and different experiences out there. And when we think about networking with HR, that there's so many different things that have happened and occurred that we can really learn from each other as well, which I think has been one of our goals with these interviews as well, is being able to learn from each other and share our experiences.
Yep.
So thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it. I like your comments.
Oh,
There you go. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.